Hi, I'm Sleep Aid, your local sleep paralysis demon, and today we'll be reviewing 10 more Webtoon Legends contest entries. Now, I will be reviewing these based on how well they serve as entries in the contest, how well they establish the stories that they are trying to tell, and how well they act as an introduction to those stories, and I'll be judging them specifically within the confines of the contest and what I think makes a good entry. Now, as you know, I made this post on the Canvas subreddit asking for a series to review, and so that's where all of these came from. I've been doing them chronologically in the order that they've been submitted, and after this video, I'll be just about caught up on them. Now, since the contest results will actually be announced in a little less than 2 weeks now, I don't know how many more series I'll be reviewing. I'm not sure how many more of these we're going to do. But for today, we'll be taking a look at Confetti Club, Thorns of Flowers, Kay the Cookie Char Dragon, Dentist in a Zombie Apocalypse, Heirs of Aquamarine, How to Radicalize a Trophy Wife, Dishes of Dubious Origin, When the Silent Bird Sings, Seafood Salad, and Omen of Nine. So we've got quite a selection here today, and I think there should be quite a lot to talk about. I do want to add a bit of a disclaimer with this one, because these comics, I did the reading for them a few days ago. It's been a little while since I read most of them, a few days, whereas usually I read the comics immediately before recording the videos, and so some of the details might not be quite as fresh in mind as I usually prefer to have them, but I think that I should still be able to give a decent response to each one. So let's go ahead and get started with Confetti Club by Kuro/E. It is a romance slice of life, and the description reads, "Between laughter, first loves, and well-kept secrets, Alex, Amy, and Lee live high school to the fullest. Nothing is ever simple when you're juggling emotions, boys, and families with hidden stories. Ready to follow their journey? Confetti Club is an explosion of colors, drama, and unforgettable moments." Alright, so let's go ahead and dive on in to the first episode here, and we'll roll through it and I'll talk about it. So, essentially the description does do a decent job of establishing what's going on. This is kind of a slice of life style story. Well, it is in the slice of life genre, but the 3 episodes follow a group of what seems to be 4 friends as they go about their high school lives and how they become intertwined in small ways. And so this is primarily like categorized in the romance genre, but something that I noticed right away about it was that it doesn't really set up any romance in the first 3 episodes, and so we have a lot of characters being introduced to each other, but we don't really establish the romance aspect of it, and so that's something that I think could have been focused on a little bit more. We spend a lot of time just kind of explaining what each character is doing in high school. There's one that's running for class president, there's one that ends up getting help studying from another girl who's the top of the class, and little things like that are kind of going on, but we don't really establish what the main romantic intertwinements are, what the main romantic interests are, and we don't really tie those characters together in a significant way, if that makes sense. And so we have our main character. She notices a boy climbing on the roof as she's going to school the one day, and then she later ends up sitting next to him. And so it seems like they're being set up as love interests for each other, but we don't really get an elaboration on that, and so I feel like we haven't quite done enough setup here in terms of building the expectation for how these relationships could possibly develop or where it might go. As it stands, we've done a lot to introduce the characters and show what their personalities are and the way they interact with each other, and all of that stuff is very fun, but I just think that for a romance comic, it could do a little bit more of setting up the actual romantic elements, and so that's the one thing that I would really comment on in terms of ways that it could be improved, just because it is a romance series primarily, and so there would be an expectation that there's going to be a little bit more movement on the romance, a little bit more of an inciting incident and kind of a reason for these characters to be tethered together. And it feels like after these 3 episodes, we don't really know who we're meant to focus on as a potential romantic couple. And so we've introduced so many characters, but we've jumped around through so many different situations that we don't really have a core of the story. And so I think it does a lot of things well, and it works really well so far as a slice of life, but I do wish that it had a bit more romance in it. Nevertheless, I will be curious to see how it develops. Okay, next we'll be taking a look at Thorns of Flowers by Clodulls. It is a romance slice of life as well. The description reads, "People and flowers are similar. They are beautiful and strong, and they fight for their lives. They both sometimes have to take care of thorns that come to their lives and are the reason for a lot of changes that are inseparable part of life. Young girl woke up in unknown place. She didn't know how she got there and what is the purpose of her unexpected journey. She had to adapt to new reality to find out why she appeared in this world and to help her new companions change their fate." So, as you might have noticed by the description, the English in this comic is not that good, and so it can sometimes be confusing to read, but let's jump in and we'll talk more about it. So, essentially what happens in the 3 episodes of this comic is a girl wakes up in a strange place. She seems to not look like herself, and there is a strange man there, and the two of them talk to each other. And so it appears to be an isekai story, but it's not really made clear if it actually is, and most of our 3 episodes are spent on this kind of joke, playing with the character's belief that she's in a dream, and so she's constantly going through these checklists trying to figure out what type of dream she's having, and meanwhile we have a lot of cutaway gags to representations of her brain and heart talking to her as she debates internally about what is going on, and that is essentially all that really happens. And so it kind of feels like we haven't really got the narrative started over the course of these 3 episodes, and so I think that it spends a little bit too much time on the jokes, on the cutaway gags, on the dream checklists and whatnot. It spends a little bit too much time on metaphors. It's constantly diving in and out of metaphors, but it doesn't really establish what the story is actually about. And so it feels like the runtime is kind of padded, like a lot of things have been inserted just to make sure that the episodes were long enough to get to the 40 panel minimum to make sure that the entry met the requirements of the contest, but it doesn't feel like the time in these 3 episodes is being used very deliberately. And so by the end of it, it's really difficult to tell what the story is actually going to be about. I think that it needs to get to the point a little bit faster and explain to the viewer what the story is actually about. And so, since we spend so much time with our main character trying to figure out if she's a dream, we, the reader, also don't know if she's in a dream or not. And so it's never really made clear if this is a dream or reality, and so much time is spent with her questioning that it might be a dream that we, the reader, begin to start questioning that as well, and we don't really establish a connection between her and this man that she meets here, and it seems like we haven't really got the story moving yet. And so, as an introduction to our main character, this kind of works, but it doesn't really establish itself as a romance slice of life, and it doesn't really get the plot moving. It kind of ends before anything significant happens. And so when we spend so much long with the character trying to figure out her situation, we're effectively spending a lot of time with her just thinking about what's going on without anything new actually happening. And so speeding up the pace, I think, would improve this story a lot, helping just kind of move things along and, again, explaining to the reader what the story is actually going to be about, giving them an idea of where it might actually be going. Nevertheless, I think it is good as an attempt, and I would be curious to find out what it is actually about. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into Kay the Cookie Jar Dragon. Kay the Cookie Jar Dragon. That's almost a tongue twister. By Aquamarine Ryu. It is a comedy slice of life. And the description reads, everyday life gets a lot more complicated when Andrea wins a cookie jar in a contest and discovers a dragon fairy named Kay has already made it her new home. Together with her best friend Melanie, mischievous cat Mr. Sprinkles, and new magical friend Kay, Andrea finds that fun and adventure are just a moment away. Well, I would say that the description does act as a good introduction to the base premise of the comic that does pretty effectively describe everything that happens in the comic. So, two friends are hanging out, they win a sweepstakes, and Kay ends up inheriting this incredible cookie jar, which it is then revealed to house a dragon fairy, Unfortunately, that's kind of all that happens, and so as a comedy slice of life, it does go through effort to put in amounts of humor. There are plenty of jokes, and ultimately, that's going to be subjective. Whether or not it's your sense of humor will determine if those jokes land or not, but there is a decent amount of humor peppered in throughout it. I think my biggest concerns with this entry were just that even though it is a slice of life story, meaning that it's going to be a little bit slower paced and not necessarily have a major overarching narrative, it doesn't really set up any narrative, and so it's kind of hard to tell where this is going to go. It's a little bit harder to get invested in the characters just because they don't really seem to be doing anything other than hanging out, eating cookies, and talking about eating cookies. And so we introduce our inciting incident in this comic, which is our character winning a cookie jar, which happens to house a dragon fairy. But when our characters meet the dragon fairy, we don't really get an explanation of what a dragon fairy is or why that this is important, how this will change their lives, and what this is going to kind of cause going forward. And so it would have been nice just to get a little bit more information on the dragon fairy, on why she's here, on what the consequences for her being here might be, and that would kind of help us get more invested in these characters and the misadventures that they are apparently going to be going on. But I think that's kind of all I've really got to say about it critically, is just that, yeah, I would perhaps recommend speeding up the pace a little bit more. I think it would have been good to get a little bit more info on the dragon fairy, and again, just how this event is going to affect the lives of the two friends, and again, kind of setting more of a stage for what types of adventures and silly scenarios they will be getting into, whereas this does a good job of introducing our three main characters, at least in terms of the personalities, the way that they interact with each other, but it's hard to really see much further than that, since there isn't really a lot more given to us than that. So I think as a comedy slice of life, it does an alright job of establishing the tone. I just wish that we knew a little bit more about the situation so that we could kind of invest more in it. That said, though, I will be curious to see how it develops. I do think it's also worth mentioning that if you are a Webtoon creator on Webtoons, you can rate your own series. So if your series has 0-star rating, that means you haven't done that yet, so I would recommend it. Okay. Next we'll be taking a look at Dentist in a Zombie Apocalypse by Sophia. It is a comedy zombie series, and the description reads, "All Joe cares about is finally starting his own dental clinic. Unlucky for him, a literal zombie apocalypse starts on his very first day. Can Joe navigate his new reality? Will meeting Lizzie, who once felt stuck but now thrives in chaos, help him find his purpose in life? A goofy slice-of-life zombie apocalypse story with a sprinkle of romance." Okay, so this comic was an interesting one, and so I felt that with the title being Dentist in a Zombie Apocalypse, it kind of seemed like it was going to be setting up a bit of an obvious gag, which was the centering of the character being a dentist, being a dental practitioner, but I felt like it didn't really use that element at all, and so the title never really became relevant to the story. Our main character is a dentist, and he is in a zombie apocalypse, but the dentistry angle is not really explored much, and so other than him starting the series off at his dental practice in the first episode, dentistry doesn't really get mentioned again, and so it kind of feels like the name is almost a little bit misleading because the series doesn't take advantage of the potential humor that it might establish from focusing on the dentistry element. And it actually seems to spend more time on the second lead, the female lead, who loves plants and is also a championship martial artist, and so we immediately jump to her in the second episode, and I think by the end of the 6 episodes, we've actually spent more time with her, even though the title of the series is named after the male lead, the dentist. And so it feels like the narrative is not really quite focused. It doesn't seem to know exactly what it wants to do, and I don't think that it gets the best use out of its gimmicks that it could. I think that it starts with an interesting premise. It starts with a silly enough gimmick. It just doesn't really utilize it to the fullest. It also feels like things are a little bit rushed. This is a comedy slice of life, and so it's not really meant to be taken that seriously. It's a little bit lighthearted. It's kind of silly, but it does feel like some of the events are a little bit contrived in a way that they kind of just play out in a way that just gets the story moving as quickly as possible, which can be a good thing at times, but it can also make it harder to be invested in them. So the way that our characters meet is our female lead is running home from the zombies, and she stumbles upon the male lead, who is also being accosted by zombies. She simply grabs him and drags him back to her apartment, and that's how they meet. And so it just seems like it's very... I'm not sure what the word is that I would use to describe it, but not quite efficient, almost a stretch beyond that, in a sense that we're just trying to get our characters into the apartment without really worrying about how we get there, and so it kind of just happens in the fastest possible way, which is female lead saves the male from zombies and drags him to the apartment with no further context than that. And so we've kind of just shoved them into the position that we wanted them into for the comic, but we've done it in a way to where it was a little too rushed and haphazard to a point where it almost stops being interesting because it happens so quickly that we don't really have anything to latch onto. And so it just seems like the opportunity was missed to have an interesting meeting between these characters to kind of help the readers get a little bit more invested in them, especially since the description of the comic hints at a romance, and so the first meeting in a romance is always going to be kind of important, and the opportunity for comedy is high when you have two very specific characters. You have a plant-loving martial artist, and you have a dentist who is starting out his first day on the zombie apocalypse, and so it's almost like the setup for some kind of joke, but there's never a punchline. They just happen to run into each other, and there's not really any clever use of their different backgrounds, and so it feels like there's not as much comedy in this as I would expect there to be for something titled the way this is titled. It seems like it doesn't really take the time to set up as many jokes as it potentially could, considering how silly the premise is, and so I'm not really sure how to feel about it. It just kind of gives the impression that it hasn't quite utilized the full potential of this idea as a comedy setup, and I just think that it could have gone a little bit further with that. And so another thing, this is kind of just a silly nitpick that I had, but I noticed that the last episode, the characters they're trapped in the plant lover's apartment because, well, they are holed up here for a zombie apocalypse, but we jump to a scene where they're sharing a pizza, and, well, one can only wonder how they were able to get a pizza delivered in the zombie apocalypse, but it's not really addressed. And so, anyways, we have the two of them kind of getting to know each other, but that's all that really happens. And so it simultaneously feels like things have moved too quickly here, to where we haven't really dwelled on important scenes that would help us get a better feel for our characters and how they interact with each other. But it also feels like not much has happened because we kind of skipped over the potential moments that would have been more interesting, those moments where they met and got to know each other and how they kind of came to be in this predicament. And so I think that it seems like the focus is a little bit misaligned on this comic, where it doesn't quite feel like a comedy, but it doesn't really seem to know what it wants to be. And so I think that I'm not really sure, having read this, what I really was supposed to get out of it. I'm not really seeing the author's vision in it. I'm not quite sure what it was meant to be going for, and so I do think that it does do some things very well, and it's an interesting premise that has a lot of potential. I think it didn't quite hit the mark for me, and so I'd like to see how it develops and how some of these elements can potentially get used. This dentist in a zombie apocalypse, it seems like a pretty simple gimmick. I would like to see how it plays out and how it can be utilized narratively going forward, so I do look forward to reading more of this. But I think that these first 6 episodes kind of left me wanting more, but not in quite the right way. I feel like we've missed a few opportunities here, but nevertheless, I do wish you luck. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Heirs of Aquamarine by Trindade. This is a fantasy comedy, and the description reads, in a distant past, explorers seek a new home on an island adorned with a mysterious sea crystal used as a channel for a strange curse. Rebuilt and thriving through a bond of friendship between two peoples, Aquamarine's past resurfaces with the awakening of strange apparitions that bring together an unlikely trio of young people whose lives become intertwined with the history of Aquamarine. Okay. So, this was one that gave me a lot of mixed impressions as I read it. So it seems like the type of story that the author put a lot of thought into, and it seems like they probably do have very, very interesting plans for it. And I think that it has an interesting art style, it's got fun characters, and it introduces a lot of characters, but I do think that over the course of the 3 episodes we have here, it doesn't quite get to the point fast enough, and so it's kind of hard to tell after reading it what the story is actually about. And so it has so many different characters that it can be a little bit difficult to follow at times, because we're jumping between around 6 or 7 different characters, and so we're constantly seeing different stories and different perspectives, and we've got all these different things going on at once, and so it's a little bit unfocused. It's a little bit hard to tell right away what the story is actually going to be about. And so it's introducing a lot of characters, and it's introducing a lot of different plot threads and a lot of elements, but I do think it might be doing a few too many things at once at the beginning of the story, to where it can seem kind of overwhelming and a little bit difficult to process. And so we spend so much time setting up our characters and building up all the different ways that they bump into each other and get to know each other and all the connections that they have, but we haven't quite established what direction the plot is going in. And so it seems that there are characters that have magical powers, and there's a connection to the history of the island, and there are ghost sightings happening, and so some of our characters get together and they go to investigate that. And we happen to know, as the audience, that 2 of them have some form of magic powers, but the third one going along in the adventure doesn't really know that yet, and it's not clear how it all connects just yet. And so there are a lot of interesting plot threads being set up here. I just think that it doesn't quite get to the point. And so it's spending a lot of time on the characters, the relationships, and just the lives that they lead. But I do think that getting to the real crux of the plot a little bit faster would help build investment in it, because it ends kind of on a cliffhanger. It ends before the inciting incident truly can happen, and so we don't really know what type of story this is going to be. And it is also in the fantasy category, which means it's competing under the most epic category of the contest. And so for that type of series, I think that there would be an expectation that there would be really, really exciting things going on, like fight scenes and action sequences and, fantastical powers and whatnot. And this doesn't appear to be that kind of fantasy, although it does hint at magic powers that some of the characters might have, so maybe it will be later. But if it is going to be that, that's the type of thing that would be better to show right away. It would be better to kind of give us a taste of the type of fantasy that we're going to get with this. And so we spend a lot of time on backstory, we spend a lot of time on characters, but it isn't really clear what type of story this is going to be based on these 3 episodes. And so though I think the character work is very good, I do wish that we had gotten a little bit more narrative thrust, and so I am concerned that it kind of ends before telling us what it's going to actually be about. And so there's a few hints at the direction, but I'm not sure if it's enough to really speculate on. And so I am very curious to see what it actually will be about, where it actually will go, because again, the lore is very interesting, the characters are fun. I just wish it had kind of gotten there a little bit faster, but I'll be curious to see where it goes from here. Okay, next we'll be looking at How to Radicalize a Trophy Wife by Sub Sam Jam. And this is a romance sci-fi. The description reads, Amarissa is a proud trophy wife of Castellan Ember, the richest man in the galaxy. She has everything she wants, and she worked not very hard to get. But while attending a charity event for her husband's latest financial endeavor, she encounters a mysterious blonde man who may have her questioning the cost of her privileged existence. Okay. Oh, it seemed to start at the bottom. Here we go. So this one is pretty much exactly what the description described, and I think it's very well done. I do have to say, unfortunately, I kind of have the same criticism of it as I have with so many of these contest entries, which is just that I think that it doesn't get to the point quite fast enough. And so I did read in one of the descriptions that there were 120 more panels planned for the entry that just couldn't be finished in time, and so potentially there was a little bit more here that we just didn't quite get, and it does kind of feel like it is missing something in a way. And so the story does do a good job of kind of establishing the scenario really quickly. So we get a very quick introduction to our main character, we learn about the life that she leads, and then we see an event that demonstrates the type of life that she leads and the type of events that she's used to going to and the relationship that she has with her husband. And so all of that is established very quickly and very efficiently and very well done. And then we introduce our actual male lead, who seems to be the true love interest, and turns out to be some kind of criminal. And so essentially the story appears to be about, well, kind of what the title says, the radicalization of a trophy wife. And so our main character is, again, she's shown to be pretty content with her life. She's got a wealthy husband and lives a lavish lifestyle, but kind of complains about a lack of passion. And so she immediately sees something in this handsome stranger, and they talk a little bit about the exhibit that they're actually attending, only for the space station they're on to then fall under attack shortly thereafter. And because of the conversation that she has with this man, she kind of questions the involvement that her husband may have had with the events that led to this exhibit being created in the first place. And so it's pretty efficient about setting that up, about introducing the important characters and getting them in the same room as each other very quickly and getting them talking to each other very quickly. I do think, though, that it could have potentially delved a little deeper into some of these conversations, just because we have, again, our trophy wife who appears to be happy with her lifestyle, but not necessarily happy with her relationship. But she seems to very, very quickly build a sense of trust for this stranger who reveals himself to be associated with the criminals that are attacking the space station very quickly. And the comic kind of ends at a point where she's opting to trust him, but it doesn't really do a good job of establishing why she trusted him so quickly and why she was willing to turn her back on her husband and work with this stranger. And so it ends before I feel the inciting incident truly finished, and it kind of seems like we haven't fully gotten to the part where their fates become truly intertwined. And so where it leaves off, they're kind of in the middle of a conversation and they're about to determine what their next move will be, but it doesn't really end up happening. And so the biggest thing that I think I could say about this is just that, yeah, it would have benefited from a little bit more, just kind of establishing how these two characters actually get caught up with each other. And so does he kidnap her, take her off the space station into his pirate gang, or does she go willingly with him, or how do they end up kind of proceeding from here, and how does she end up getting away from her husband? That's the type of thing that would be good to include, just because it would kind of build a sense of the structure, a sense of framework. Again, as I said, I feel like the inciting incident didn't entirely finish, and so it kind of drops about halfway through that inciting incident, and so it isn't entirely clear what's going to happen next, so it's a little bit harder to get invested in it for that reason. We know that she is sympathetic to the criminal, and we know that she is immediately attracted to him in some way, and we can speculate that she's probably going to end up going with him, but we don't really get confirmation with that. And so again, it just feels like it dropped at kind of an awkward spot since what happens next is probably the most important indicator of what direction the story is going to go. How she proceeds out of this situation that she's in would really set the entire trajectory of the plot. And so does she go back with her husband but continue to think about this guy and, work with him from the inside, or does she leave her husband and go with him? Which direction is it going to go? That's the type of thing that I wish we could have gotten answered in the contest entry, but I do think that in terms of setting up the atmosphere, the setting, the characters, and just the overall tone of the comic, I think that all that was handled pretty well. And so it's a good start for this type of story. It just feels like it needed a little bit more to finish setting up what it was trying to set up. And so I think it does almost everything well. It just could have gone a little bit further. And I'll go ahead and put likes on the remainder of the episodes. But yes, I do think that this series has a lot of potential. There's a good sense of humor with it. It is intelligently written. And again, it handles the characters and the setting very well. And so I will be very curious to see what happens next. I do think I'd like to read more of this. So. Okay. Next up we have Dishes of Dubious Origin by Beanworms. This is a comedy slice of life. The description reads, Faye and Ash are just two roommates who burned down their entire apartment building and poisoned their neighbors in a cooking accident. As punishment, they must spend the rest of their lives running a cafe by themselves. But if their cafe goes out of business, they'll be executed in a pool of electric eels. When every cooking attempt ends in absolute disaster, what sort of bizarre strategies will they resort to in an attempt to keep their cafe afloat? Well, the description of this comic essentially captures exactly what type of comic it is and exactly what it's about. And so this being a comedy, of course, it is important to note that the humor will be very important to determining the quality of it. Do the jokes land? How many jokes are they? Are they well constructed? How clever is it? And for the most part, I thought that the humor was pretty funny. It does kind of fall on the absurd side, and so this is the type of comic that clearly doesn't take itself very seriously, and as it progresses, it seems to get more and more surreal. And so a lot of the humor in the comic is derived from the sheer unpredictable nature of it. And so it starts out fairly grounded, fairly mundane, with the inciting incident, which is the characters accidentally poisoning their apartment and then being sentenced to opening a cafe and making it successful, or otherwise they'll die, just as the description said. That's our first two episodes here. And so our characters decide, since they're terrible at cooking, they'll simply go out and find meals. They'll source things from strange places that taste good on their own, that don't require cooking. And so that's what we spend the rest of our runtime on. There is an adventure into a forest to find a mythical milkshake cow, and they do find it. And what proceeds is, well, very difficult to explain, but as I said, a lot of the humor in this series seems to be derived from sheer absurdity. It's hard to choose the right word. This is a comic that, as I said, is very difficult to describe. And so it doesn't really seem to have its own internal logic. And so a lot of the jokes are predicated on it being impossible to predict what will happen next. which it is, although I do think that it could go a little bit more into the internal logic. It would be a little bit nicer to have a sense of logic to it, just so that we could kind of understand what's going on, whereas instead what it focuses on is almost a type of shock humor. I don't really know how else to describe it, but it is actually funny. I did find it very enjoyable, just because I suppose this is my sense of humor, but it's the type of thing where it's so unpredictable that it's kind of impossible to follow. Like, it's fascinating to read because you absolutely never know what's going to happen next, and you can't even begin to imagine what might happen next, and so it kind of seems to just be strange things happening that are often funny in how strange they are, but narratively it is difficult to describe. And so here's a good example of kind of what I mean. So our characters, they attempt to milk the mythical cow, but the cow establishes a game of udder roulette where if they choose the wrong udder, then something bad will happen, and until they get the right one, bad things will continue to happen. And so they pull one, and the entire udder detaches and runs away, and so they have to capture him before he escapes. So one of our characters is trying to keep on task, and she says there's no time to stop and think. Here, I found an egg with a leg, throw it at the milky bastard. And so this is one of those moments that when you see it, it's funny because, well, an egg with a leg is so absurd and ridiculous that it's kind of funny to look at. What is that? Where did that come from? But because there's no internal logic, I mean, we never establish where she found the egg with the leg. Is this a normal thing to find? Does this happen all the time? Does it grow on trees? Where does it come from? And so it just kind of gets introduced because it's funny. And so Faye throws it at the milky bastard and stops him, which allows them to continue the game of udder roulette. And so this is all very entertaining, but there's not really a chain of logic that you can follow with it, because it reinvents the logic essentially every moment. And so moment to moment, it kind of warps its own reality. And it's the type of comic that is not easy to describe, but I do think that it is very enjoyable to read. And so it's difficult even to talk about. I think it's a type of surrealistic absurdity that could best be compared to the types of things that used to play on Adult Swim back in the day. It's almost not quite stoner humor, but something adjacent to that, something on that kind of spectrum somewhere. And so just the sheer unpredictable nature of it, again, makes it very, very hard to follow the actual plot and the actual story, but it is so surprising and so unpredictable that it does continue to be funny if this is a style of humor that you are amused by. And so I liked it very much, but I don't know if I could recommend it to everyone because some people just won't get it. That said, I do think that I wish it had spent a little bit more time on the cafe, since 4 of our 6 episodes are kind of spent dealing with this cow situation, and so we don't really get a lot of the characters working on their business, their cafe, since most of our runtime is spent on this misadventure attempting to get milk. And so I kind of wanted to see a little bit more of the business side of things, and I think it's just kind of because the episodes are short, since as a comedy entry it doesn't need to have more than 15 panels per episode, and so it doesn't spend too much time on each episode, and so we don't really get back to the cafe. And it ends right before that happens, and so I would have liked to see a little bit more of these two characters as business owners rather than as adventurers, collecting milk, but that's the type of thing that obviously we'll get more of in the proceeding episodes, but I do think that, yeah, as I said, this story is just, it's very difficult to describe, and it's kind of one of those things that I think you'll either really like it or really not. There's not a lot of middle ground. It's so stylistic. It's so specific in the type of humor and the tone that it goes for that some people are going to really love it and other people are just not going to get it. But I thought it was quite fun, and so yes, if you're into really absurd humor with no real chain of logic, then this one is great at that. It has fun characters in silly situations that obviously aren't meant to be taken that seriously, and it will endlessly surprise you with its ability to become more and more absurd in ways that you could never have predicted. So, good job on that. As I said, I would actually like to read more of it, and I'll be curious to see how their business works out. Okay, next up is When the Silent Bird Sings by Janice Riviera. It is a drama romance. The description reads, for Sanjin Kim, becoming successful meant leaving his past behind, but after a sudden injury forces him to stay and recover in his hometown, he comes face to face with Jia Park, his personal physical therapist, and the woman who shattered his heart 6 years ago. As buried feelings resurface, Sanjin must confront the past he's tried to forget, unaware that Jia's held on to a life-changing secret. With hidden truths beginning to unravel, will he walk away again, or fight for the love he once lost? Okay. So, my first impression with this series was just that it is very professionally done, and, we're starting with a preview. Let's get to our first episode. So, it is very professionally done. It definitely looks the part of a proper webtoon, and it does a good job of delivering on that. The writing is pretty solid. It seems very well written in general, and it does a good job of setting up its characters and kind of putting them together in an interesting way. But the thing that I felt the most after reading it was just that it didn't quite land the hook, or rather the hook hasn't quite happened yet. And so something that this series seems to do a lot is build mystery. It's constantly introducing elements that you're meant to wonder about, but it doesn't really give very many answers. And yes, I mean, as a contest entry, it's only a few episodes, so there's not really a lot of time to pay off all of the questions that it's setting up, but it does feel like it spends more time establishing mysteries than it does kind of telling us things, and so it feels like we could probably give a little bit more info to the audience a little bit more quickly so that they could kind of get invested in the actual scenario. And so essentially what it's about is what the description said, which is a physical therapist reuniting with a childhood friend of hers through a interesting coincidence. And there seems to be something going on with her life that, again, is left a bit mysterious, but it's revealed that she has a daughter. It's not revealed who the father is, and so we're kind of meant to wonder about that, and who he is, who he might be, and what he might do. And so there's definitely room for speculation on that, but I do think that as a hook to the series, it would have been better if they had kind of answered that question a little faster. And so it seems like he might be possibly some kind of criminal or gangster or something of that nature, but it's not revealed, and so we don't really know what the stakes are in this comic. And then we kind of have this divide between our main character, the physical therapist, and the childhood friend that she's meant to be treating. He doesn't want her to treat him. He doesn't want to agree to it. And so it kind of feels like the comic ends before it really establishes, again, what the hook is that is going to tie these characters together. And so I think it definitely shows a lot of promise. I just think that it just could have benefited from getting to the point a little bit faster and kind of just establishing a little bit more what the framework of the narrative was going to be. One other minor thing that just kind of stood out to me, it's not important, but it was noticeable, was just that the way the characters are drawn really kind of stood out, because I felt like every male character kind of had a pretty similar physique, and it looked like they were all built off of the same model. And so even, an old man, our character's boss, at many angles that he's shown, seems to be in extremely good shape. And so every character is just like basically all sliders maximum. They're just in the best possible shape they can be. And so I think that that's not entirely uncommon with a romance comic like this, but it was just something that I kind of noticed how exaggerated some of the proportions of the characters were. Even the side characters, again, just being essentially given model proportions, just felt a little bit jarring at times. And it's one of those things where obviously a comic full of beautiful people is more fun to look at, and that's something that Webtoon audiences very much enjoy, but there is a little bit that is, I think, lost in the mix, which is usually with a comic like this, the especially beautiful looking ones, or like the characters with the really picturesque proportions or what have you, are going to be the main characters. And so when everybody has these really, really exaggerated proportions, it kind of makes it hard to tell who the focus of the story is in a way, because you're expecting, as a reader of this type of media, you're kind of expecting it to be the lead characters that are the really gorgeous ones, but everybody's gorgeous. And so it does kind of add a little bit of visual confusion, but this isn't really a major problem. It was just kind of a nitpick that I had. Anyways, as I said, I think that this story obviously sets a lot up, and it seems like it's going in interesting directions. I just think that all it's missing is a little bit more of a hook. It could have a bit of a stronger hook for the ending of the third episode. And I wish it had maybe answered a few more questions. It seems to propose a lot of questions, but it doesn't answer very many of them, and so I think that it could have given us a little bit more to latch on to get invested in. So I'm very curious to see where it goes from here, but I do feel like I need a little bit more information to get invested in. Alright, and I will go ahead and put a like on every episode, and yeah, I, again, definitely would like to see how this one develops, but until then, I wish you luck. Okay, next we'll be looking at Seafood Salad by Mochi Penguino. It is a comedy, and the description reads, Arena, a recent high school graduate, embarks on a carefree beach vacation with her friends, eager to enjoy her last moments of freedom before college. However, her summer takes an unexpected turn when she discovers that she is a mermaid. She then meets two crabs, Tick and Mike, who turn her world upside down. Will Arena's summer vacation be memorable, or something she would want to forget? Okay, so this story, I think, doesn't really know how to establish itself. So it is labeled as a comedy, and it does have a comedic atmosphere to it, with our crab characters and our fish kind of recalling events, but it kind of takes a gamble by telling the story out of order. So we first meet our crab characters, and they recount a series of events that they were involved in with a mermaid sighting. And then the king tasks them with bringing the mermaid back. They agree to doing this, and again, we are now on the third episode, where we've only seen our main character in a comedic flashback, and so I think that starting the story in this way was a bold choice. I don't know if it really worked out, though. Usually with this type of story, it's you want to introduce the main character right away, and so starting with the crabs makes it seem like they might be the main character, and I don't know, spending 3 episodes before introducing the main character feels almost out of order, and I think it spends a lot of time talking about how the crabs found a mermaid, and then we jump back to our main character's perspective, and we see how she begins to go on this vacation that was described in the description of the comic, and it ends with her getting in the water at the beach, where she turns into a mermaid. And so I do kind of feel like we haven't quite got to the point, so we're a little bit missing the full extent of the inciting incident, which is something I feel like I've said a lot today, a lot in this video, but I don't think we quite finished the inciting incident with this story, which is our character turning into a mermaid while she's at the beach with her friends, and that's where the entry ends. And so we don't really know if any of her friends know about it. We don't know if they're going to find out. Is she going to keep a secret, or is she going to tell them? And we do happen to know from our first 3 episodes that we've got these 2 crabs that are attempting to catch her and bring her back to the king. And so we've got a basic setup. We've got a little bit of our setup, but I just feel like we're missing the other half of it, which is how her friends get involved in this. Again, do they know about it? Does she decide to tell them or keep it a secret? What direction do we take with that? And so that would kind of help build a little bit more of an investment if we kind of had a deeper connection with our character and her friends. And so I feel like a little bit too much screen time was spent on the crabs, and it would have been better to shorten that segment and spend more time building the relationship that the characters have and focusing on that element instead. And so where we've left off, it doesn't really feel like we've kind of established what type of story this is going to be, and I just think it needed a little bit more. As I've, again, said very many times today, I do feel like if this had progressed a little bit faster, if it had spent less time on the crabs and kind of spent that time just kind of getting to the point a little bit more, it could have established the full hook, and it would have done a better job of building investment. And so I think it's a fun idea, a simple idea, but we don't really know yet, based on these 6 episodes, what type of story it's going to be. And so I would be certainly curious to see where it does go from here. I just wish that there was a little bit more to latch on to. Okay, and we find ourselves at our final comic for the night, which will be Omen of Nine by Oni 210. It is a supernatural thriller, and the description reads, as the heir to a ghoulish syndicate, Mira is weighed by her mother's desires. Her only escape is her closest friend, Roxana, until her mother plots a way to end their relationship. Betrayed, Mira revolts and flees with Roxana to protect her against her mother's wrath. Amid the chase, a familiar dark entity reemerges from Mira's childhood, revealing hidden mysteries around her mother. Troubled by chaos within her and the weight of expectations around her, will Mira succumb to a deadly reawakening? Alright, so let's go ahead and dive into this, and we'll talk about it. Okay, so what stood out to me really about this story is that it is very, very fast-paced, and usually I have the opposite complaint. Usually with most of these contest entries, as I've said so many times today, they don't quite get to the point fast enough, and so it feels like there isn't enough there to latch on to, whereas this one actually has a little bit of the opposite problem, where it moves so quickly that it's kind of hard to tell what's actually going on. And so I do like, especially in the fantasy category, when a series gets right into the action and like starts moving very quickly. This one being a supernatural, it's actually in the most gripping category, and so it seems like it could probably afford to slow down a little bit and build more tension, but instead it moves so quickly that we don't have as much tension because we haven't fully been invested in the stakes of each situation yet. And so there's a lot going on with magic powers and potential demonic possessions and some kind of secret underground magical organizations that are feuding with each other, and something that I think this comic really, really would benefit from is slowing down a little bit and explaining to the readers what any of these elements actually are. And so some stuff we can kind of learn just by intuition, just by reading it. We can kind of figure it out as we go, but there are a lot of really, really specific things happening in this world that are not explained to the reader, and so it makes it very confusing when the characters are throwing around all these terms and we don't know what they mean. And so we could either have a character explain it in some way, or even just have a simple text box that very briefly explains what it is, just saying, kind of what these terms actually mean. And so we jump into it so quickly, and we get moving so quickly, and we spend so little time setting anything up or explaining anything, and again, it's hard to be invested in because we don't really know how any of this works, and so we don't really know enough about the world that these characters are in. We really could use a bit more world building and a bit more lore, just kind of explaining how these powers work, what these organizations are, why they don't like each other, and how our characters kind of got into this scenario that they're in. And so I think that it's presenting a very interesting vignette of this world, and it's presenting very interesting characters with interesting concepts, but since it doesn't explain any of those concepts, it's kind of hard to grasp them. And yeah, I just think that, especially with the most gripping category, that element of tension is so important, that very, very deliberate pacing is so important, whereas this comic particularly doesn't really dwell on any one scene. It kind of moves from scene to scene very quickly. The scenarios kind of blend into each other very quickly, and so we never really have time to quite build the amount of tension that we might want out of this. And again, it seems like there are a lot of good ideas here. It seems like there's a really interesting story here, and there's a really interesting world with characters that I think the author probably knows very well, and ideas that I think the author probably has very fleshed out internally, but just that don't get explained to the reader. And so I can tell that there's a very interesting narrative in here, and probably a lot of interesting lore and backstory, but it's just not really conveyed through these 3 episodes. And so I find this entry intriguing. I think that's the word I would use. It's very intriguing, but it's a little bit hard to follow since no real effort is taken to explain what is actually going on. And so I definitely see a lot of potential in this. I just can't fully grasp it. I can't fully understand it. And I wish that it would slow the pace a little bit and kind of explain to us why all of this is important and what all of this even means, what all these powers are, what these organizations are, kind of the connections that these characters have between each other. That's the type of thing that I think it would benefit from. So the pacing seems like it seems like it's paced for the most epic category. I guess that's the easiest way to describe it. It's paced like an action series. But because it's in the supernatural category, it's actually competing with mostly horror stories. And so I feel like, again, under the most gripping category, I would expect a slower, more methodical pace with a little bit more emphasis on tension. But I do quite like this. And again, I think that with a little bit of time to kind of establish more of the world, as I said, I do see a lot of potential in this one. And so I'll be curious to see where it goes next, and hopefully we get some of those explanations. But I do think it is very good otherwise, and so good job on that. Alright, anyway, that is all I've got for today. I hope I did an okay job of kind of explaining my thoughts on some of these. I don't want to come off as too negative, but, well, as I've said so many times, I'm judging these as contest entries. I'm judging these as kind of pilot episodes, effectively, for each of their respective series, and so I'm kind of looking at it from the outside, trying to determine how well I can grasp a series based off of these early episodes, and how well I can kind of speculate on like what type of direction it might go in, what type of story it actually is going to be, and what type of audience that story might have. And so that's kind of how I tend to look at these, and so I do kind of dwell on that a lot, and that's a large part of what my focus tends to be in these reviews especially. And so I think perhaps I could probably spend more time talking about positives, but, well, we're already over an hour in, and so it's a little late to go back now, but I hope that none of this is discouraging. I do genuinely enjoy reading all of these, and I find it very fun to see all of the very creative stories that everybody has to tell. But that's going to be all for now. As I said, I don't know how many more of these reviews I'll actually be doing, since the contest will be ending kind of soon. But for now, I will see you in your nightmares.